Hello, good evening. I'm Dyer-Witheford, a professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario. And it's my pleasure to introduce this session of Big Data at the Margins. On behalf of the organizing committee, I acknowledge that this event, though held virtually, is launched from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lupanawak, and the Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We further recognize the historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada. And as members of a public institution, we accept responsibility to contribute towards revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. I want to thank the sponsors who have made this event possible: the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Faculty of Information and Media Studies here, and Western Research. So Big Data at the Margins was conceived as a series of lectures, panel events, to examine how artificial intelligence, big data, and superfast networks are affecting not the great metropolitan centers of advanced capitalism with their ambitious smart city plans, abundant network connections, and high-tech business hubs, but rather its smaller and more peripheral towns, such as our own London, Ontario. Here, such technologies are deployed in deindustrialized settings, certainly less glamorous, and also more economically marginal than those of the cosmopolitan cores, and with their own very specific configurations of prosperity, precarity, and destitution. We welcome all of you to this event, wherever you are signing in from, metropolitan or peripheral, however those positions are variously and of course always relatively mapped. So far in this series, we have investigated the issue of big data at the margins from several optics, in terms of the automated and algorithmically scored welfare provisions, in terms of policing, surveillance, and facial recognition AI. But today, we are going to look at the issue of work, labor now undergoing a double transformation, first by the ongoing digital revolutions, and now again by the pandemic situation. Our discussion unfolds under the title of Digital Piecework, the New Workers and Geographies of the Digital Economy. We have a wonderful panel to discuss these issues: Lilly Irani, Lisa Nakamura, and Greig de Peuter. I'm going to be brief in my introductions to each of these speakers, because their work is well known, and also given our medium, you can easily, instantaneously find out more about them if you haven't heard of them before. But I do want to emphasize that this brevity in introduction in no way measures our huge delight and extended gratitude at having this superb panel with us. After the panelists have talked, we will have a question and answer session. I want to encourage you to type in your questions using the Q&A button as they occur to you. We will then save them to be read to the panel to respond to in the discussion period at the end. So now, to begin, it's my pleasure to introduce, first of all, Lilly Irani, Associate Professor of Communication and Science Studies at the University of California in San Diego, author of the award-winning 2019 book, Chasing Innovation, Making Entrepreneurial Citizens in Modern India, and a co-founder and maintainer of the digital labor activism tool, Turk. Lilly, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really grateful for the chance to be in conversation with you all tonight. Thank you to the organizers here at University of Western Ontario for starting us on the question of how to support workers whose livelihoods are transformed by AI, big data, and machine learning. It's a very practical question. And I also want to give a shout out to, I see both some Amazon Mechanical Turk workers that I organize with in the audience and other friends. So thank you for being here because I've learned a lot from all of you that have kind of shaped the focus of the talk today. So the workers I want to talk about tonight power artificial intelligence through a platform called Amazon Mechanical Turk. This is a story of how software and research helped workers gain some power, but also over a decade, the software became a band-aid for a flawed system. We too often hope that good research, good tools, or good intentions might spark consciousness, deliberation, collaboration, and ultimately change. My decade of work on digital labor suggests that that's simply not the case. For a future of work with good conditions for AI workers, we need to invest the most basic resources in workers so they can take the time away from the job and create their own spaces to organize for change. Research is not enough. And so this is an exercise in self-criticism, absolutely. Building software is not enough. Reading and retweeting is not enough. Donated money is what Amazon Mechanical Turk workers need to make time to organize for the future of work that they want. And so with that teaser, first I want to talk about what is Amazon Mechanical Turk and why does it exist? So let me share the presentation because I have some illustrations. Artificial intelligence promises autonomous, almost magical automation delivered by heroic engineers and the compute power at their command. This is a myth, and it hides so many workers who make AI work. 15 years ago, Silicon Valley companies were starting to face this reality head on. Trained as a computer scientist, I worked at Google for a few years. And there, I never met, but I knew there were workforces who pitched in when automation failed or helped to train automation in the first place. At Google, these workers helped tune up a new search algorithm by judging which set of search results were better. Or they made sure that advertisers' web pages didn't violate Google's tobacco or firearms policies. My friends worked at similar companies and search startups. There, the engineers faced challenges like teaching a computer how to see the difference between porn and not porn, something even judges famously have a difficult time with. Some of them needed to convert YouTube audio to text so search engines could search it and put ads next to it, or they needed workers to look at and correct error-prone automated transcriptions. Roboticists, they needed to teach rolling robots how to see the difference between an immovable couch and a navigable carpet. Tech companies were encouraging all of us, not just tech workers, but kind of in society at large, they were encouraging all of us to upload more of our lives and work onto their servers, but they also had trouble having their algorithms understand, organize, and monetize it all. So these were the kinds of tasks that were crucial to the political economy of post-Web 2.0 internet, and they were easy for people, but hard for computers to do. They're easy for people because we grow up in culture, learning and interacting with each other and with these objects over a lifetime. That knowledge, that learning is what AI engineers need to access and extract so they can approximate it with their AI algorithms. They can never fully automate it for two reasons. First, culture changes. One day the word binders are office supplies, and the next day they become political satire when presidential candidate at the time Mitt Romney announced that he had binders full of women. Similarly, slang changes, standards of obscenity change, the shapes and forms of buses that computerized cameras look at change. Buildings fall apart, receipts fade, and algorithms need humans to help them keep up with it all or step in when they fail. AI companies will downplay this because they want you to think that they make magic and we should all be grateful to them. Amazon was no stranger to the limits and needs of AI. Their retail website hosted thousands of product vendors uploading product photos and descriptions. This patent here describes a technical problem they had. Engineers needed to understand whether two pictures taken from different angles by different cameras or by different people were actually the same product, so they can all be part of a one product page to sell us stuff. Rather than hiring full-time or even part-time workers to do this constant stream of data work, they made a gig work platform so they could outsource. That platform was called Amazon Mechanical Turk. The platform allowed engineers and academics, like people that I knew in Silicon Valley, to upload huge volumes of data tasks to the site and set a piece rate, say a penny per faded receipt transcribed. Workers from around the world, but mostly the United States, could access the platform from wherever they were, or wherever they could get internet and earn money doing the work. The platform didn't enforce a minimum wage, as Amazon declared them independent contractors. The platform empowered the engineers that I knew in Silicon Valley economically. It saved them the time and hassle of hiring long-term coworkers or signing long-term contracts with business processing outsourcing firms. These engineers could speed up their rate of technological experimentation, pivoting from one engineering strategy to another, or staying in sync with the volatility of what venture capitalists wanted to fund. And startups whose main trade was labor-intensive data processing could claim that they were AI startups, convincing venture capitalists to give them higher valuations and more funding because human workers were nowhere in sight. The platform also empowered engineers culturally. In their world of Silicon Valley beanbags and free smoothies, they didn't have to manage or deal with the awkwardness of denying coworkers these perks. The platform terms and conditions declared workers independent contractors, and my engineer friends got to imagine a worker in a hammock somewhere, free to choose where they work. The platform also handled a lot of irritating parts like recruiting, payment transfer, and contract negotiations. Since you have to click the terms and conditions, there are none. The requesters just saw the work that they put out there come back to them through a spreadsheet or mainlined straight into their code, so they never had to see or talk to the workers powering their algorithms or inquire into how they were doing. To my engineer friends, the platform was like magic. What you couldn't code, you could send out to the platform workers. The cloud was not just someone else's computer, but it was really other people. I wanted to know what platform workers felt about this work that was so empowering and magical to my engineer friends. Feminism for me had a labor politics. All work is valuable, but not usually treated as such. It also meant people's own feelings about their situation had to ground our politics. An art class in my PhD program gave me an opening to explore further. So fund the humanities. And to this end, I put out a survey asking what workers did and didn't like about their work. I also put out a prompt asking them what they would like a Turker's Bill of Rights to look like. What the 167 responses to the survey and Bill of Rights exercise revealed was that the vast majority of workers volunteered that Amazon's work rejection policies were an issue. Perhaps to placate requesters, which is what employers are called on the platform in Amazon speak, Amazon allows requesters to unilaterally decide whether they want to pay for the work that workers have done or not. The purpose of this policy is ostensibly to enable employers to deny payment for bad faith or very bad quality work. But there are no checks to make sure that the rejected work is actually bad. Nothing prevents requesters from rejecting simply to get work for free. The platform also has no system of feedback to help requesters and workers adjust their expectations about the quality of work that's needed. This policy essentially punishes workers for problems that might not be their fault. Requesters might design confusing tasks, leading workers to misunderstand their intent. Or a worker might offer an analysis a requester didn't expect. Like they might call a piece of furniture a Chesterfield or a couch rather than sofa, as is common in the US. The requester's limited perspective can then lead them to assume that the worker is the one that's wrong and shouldn't get paid. The consequences for workers are not only lost wages and time, but also a blow to what's called their approval rating. The approval rating is a percentage of tasks workers have done that have been approved by the requesters receiving that work. Many requesters use it to filter out workers, to say that only workers with this approval rating can work for me. When workers do hundreds of tasks for a single employer who turns out to reject much of their work, it can devastate their ratings, their earnings, and their access to future work. Because requesters encounter workers as spreadsheet entries or API data feeds, it's easy to ignore mutual responsibility for work errors and consequences for workers. Platform policies and a culture of privileging managerial expertise enable this kind of worker blame to go on. So reading those surveys over a decade ago, I responded in a way that I knew how. I designed a website and a browser tool. That had been my training. That was the job that I did before grad school. And Six Silberman, who was a classmate and an applied math major, he coded up the design from the class. Got a problem? We know how to build software. So briefly, the Turkopticon website what it does is it's one place where workers can quickly write reports about their experiences with employers, and then as they browse Amazon and they're evaluating the hundreds of employers that they might be able to work for, and when they're there for the day, we insert, what you see on the left here is that we will insert reviews that other workers have written about an employer right into the Amazon search interface. And if the worker wants to know more context, they can click to go to our website, where we also have comments that workers write with notes about what pissed them off or contextualizing the rating that they gave. So we ran this site for about 10 years. Amazon Mechanical Turk workers came on board to help with making day-to-day policy decisions and to do community moderation work for the site. The site allowed workers to avoid problematic employers and the possibility of rejections. There was a lot, however, the software did not do. A negative review meant that a reviewer had already suffered. Someone had to try out the new employers. It might be the worker most needing to take a risk to make ends meet that day. The site also encouraged workers to share information as individuals, but it did nothing to synthesize across employer reviews to find common issues that might require a more systematic solution. The software could bring agreements or disagreements about specific employers to the surface, but it couldn't facilitate consensus or find common points of action to change things. A decade later, tens of thousands of workers had used Turkopticon. Many told us it helped allay anxieties as they worked. A labor economist even did an empirical experiment and estimated the workers who used an employer reputation system earned 40% more than those who didn't. He did the experiment on our site, which is a whole story for Q&A if you want to get into it, because it did cause a lot of trouble in the community. But after 10 years of running the site, rejections hadn't gone away. The AI economy had only expanded and grown more flush with money, but Turk workers didn't have an organized voice in discussions of policymakers, employers, or at Amazon. It felt a little bit like I'd spent 10 years building a mutual aid tool that had become a band-aid for a broken and exploitative corner of the academic industrial complex. So in 2019, Six and I decided to turn Turkopticon into a worker-led and maintained project. We held a series of workshops to enlist workers interested in taking over governing and reorienting it. We explained our concerns to them about the software as a kind of band-aid ameliorating tensions, but not addressing upstream sources of harm. And we got a grant for the first time in the project that allowed us to pay workers $15 an hour working with us as we collectively learned to organize, plan the transition, and build a team focused on a shared organizing mission. Over the last year, this has been a transition away from Turkopticon being a software project run by a designer and an engineer and a few worker moderators. It has been a transition to an organizing project run by a growing team of Amazon Mechanical Turk workers with some funding to start to support the time, trainings, and conversations needed to learn organizing skills that neither Turking nor engineering nor being a social informatics academic gave us. Over the past year, the team of organizers has accomplished a lot. We have a lead organizer, longtime worker, Turk worker Sherry Stanley, who has been brave and willing to speak and write publicly about these issues. Worker organizers canvass Turker forums and do one-on-one conversations to understand broader needs and concerns among other Turkers. They facilitate workshops to develop creative proposals for longstanding problems like rejections. They work with a group of software engineers from Tech Worker Coalition to operate and make improvements to the software features and stability. And they have a network of mentors who help them strategize. Six and I feel very confident saying, can get hit by a bus. I hope we don't, but we can get hit by a bus, and Turkopticon will not only survive, but be actually able to address problems that the software couldn't. This year, the team did a survey of Turkers to ask what issues they thought Turkopticon should focus on. The top issue? Still rejections, just like 10 years ago. But moving forward, we've given up hope that the software and information sharing will spontaneously generate a coordinated strategy for change. Those were dreams many had for Facebook, blogs, and Twitter, that many individuals sharing information online could enable the envisioning and pursuit of political change. We've all seen that that dream can crash hard. Organizing work is not just about communication or even engagement, but about creating focus, consensus, and doing that through building trust relationships. I'm convinced that this is what is essential for a future of work that works for workers that power AI. The rejection problem that I've talked about some today is not on any policy or labor agenda that I know of. But as debates on AI and the gig economy rage on, it's important to note that the pain workers feel most directly is not necessarily what gets the attention of policymakers or the press. Unless workers organize and come to see the connections between policy issues and their immediate conditions, the prescriptions that are coming from these policymakers can be perceived as top-down impositions, a kind of rule by experts for problems that workers don't always understand are connected to the ones that they have. Turk worker organizers have a long road ahead, including coming up with proposals to the rejection problem. Just to give you a little window into some of the complexity that the worker organizers are well aware of and understand better than I do, some of what they tell me is a good solution needs to uplift good faith work done on the platform. It needs to exclude workers who spam and threaten the integrity of their craft. It needs to prevent baseless rejections, and it needs to repair harm when it actually happens. Proposals have to navigate how work and income on the platform interact with disability benefits, or workers' abilities to juggle caregiving responsibilities, or a host of other considerations that only come out when specific people in specific situations start evaluating different ways of tackling the shared problem. Improving work conditions means accounting for these unanticipated dependencies. So I was trained as a designer, and good designers, someone might argue, are trained to recognize this kind of complexity, but they are rarely accountable to the users on whose behalf they advocate. They're accountable to those who pay for their time, such as clients, or for those of us who do pro bono work, we're too often accountable to ourselves and our visions of what is the right and the good. As Six and I built and maintained Turkopticon over a decade, we tried to be accountable to workers, but ultimately our day jobs prevented us from communicating enough to see the complexities they navigated and to make decisions that were truly accountable to them. Yet Six and I found that we were the ones invited to convenings put on by policymakers, academics, and even tech companies to speak on the problems of Turk work. This is a problem. In the United States, there's a long history of policy bodies or journalists consulting by the book experts, managers, engineers, and academics to speak on issues of public concern. Today, we can add nonprofits that are run by such by the book experts sometimes to fuel what Meredith Whittaker of AI Now has called the critical academic industrial complex. And I am not claiming that, and I am very much in it. I hope that's very obvious from what I'm saying. Like, this is not me throwing shade at anybody else. I'm just trying to get a clear assessment of like what's been happening the last 12 years with this project. What such convenings did was they channeled resource investment into by the book experts, rather than developing workers' ability to collectively speak for themselves. Six and I tried resisting this over the years, getting organizers and journalists, like event organizers, not labor organizers, getting event organizers and journalists to invite mechanical Turk workers to speak. And sometimes they did, but this created its own problems when invited workers advocated a point of view not broadly supported by other workers back on the Turk forums. The product of such inclusion efforts, when not backed by collective organizing and consensus building, was conflict and mistrust by those who felt misrepresented. This mistrust was towards both the workers who were speaking at the convenings and the convening bodies themselves. So a future of work that is good for workers requires us to collectively invest in workers' collective capacities to pursue changes to the problems they face in their own workplaces. This includes giving money to get them time off the job to imagine, communicate, organize, strategize, and design. We should not be looking to academics or designers like me and Six, no matter our good intentions, to represent their will. We should not be cherry picking individual workers as a voice in the room, outsourcing the burdens of representing a group onto a token person's shoulders with no resources to actually go and do that work. The best thing many of us can do now is to give workers time by giving them money. Only after workers can create shared agendas can our other skills, tools, or institutional legitimacy support them. That can be a hard thing for humanistic academics to hear because we get paid to change ideas and theories of the world through teaching and writing. It's easy to forget that this can become its own form of idealism. It can also be a hard thing for design researchers to hear because we're trained that our research will make technology better for people, but we're rarely trained in how our own accountabilities to our jobs directs us towards problems seen as theoretically significant or technologically novel. I apologize. I don't know why my screens, did my screen stop sharing for you all?
No, you can see it.
Okay,
yeah,
I had a glitch on my side. And so, as researchers, when our accountabilities are to create theoretically significant or technologically novel findings, that directs us away from the things that those we hope to support actually want and need from us. Solidarity, not charity, means that we give, not because our others are worse off than us, but because we recognize a system that harms all of us and needs to change. And I know I haven't talked a lot about organizing kind of as an academic workers here, but I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. So I would like to end this entry into the conversation by asking you in the audience to please make a sustaining recurring donation as you can to the workers who are organizing with Turkopticon tonight. You can do so at the link posted here. And thank you so much for being here. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much for that talk, informed by so many years of activism and research. It's truly deeply appreciated, and I do look forward to the discussion of the points that you've raised. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Lisa Nakamura, professor in the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan, and the founding director of that school's Digital Studies Institute. Lisa has, since 1994, been writing on issues in the networks, particularly on issues of racialization in the networks. She is the author of important texts, too many to enumerate, but including recently Techno-Precarious, written with the Precarity Lab collective and published in 2020. It's an honor to have you here, Lisa. We look forward very much to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Greg. This is indeed the most amazing gathering. Just looking at the number of participants who are here, I'm deeply sad that we're not all in the same place, because I see so many people that I know and that have worked on digital labor for as long as we all have. So I'm gonna share this screen right now and get my PowerPoint going. Okay. So first of all, thank you for being here. It's dinner time on the East Coast. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm giving my presentation on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the single largest land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the treaty at the foot of the rapids so that their children could be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. As Greg mentioned, I teach at the University of Michigan, where I am the director of the Digital Studies Institute. And I'd like to announce as well that the Institute has recently gotten a large grant from the Mellon Foundation to found the DISCO network alongside partners Ray Fouché, Stephanie Dinkins, Catherine Knight-Steele, Remy Yurgo, and Andre Brock. DISCO means the Digital Inquiry, Speculation, Collaboration, and Optimism Network. But as you can probably tell from some of the people who are involved in it, it's also a deeply critical project that's looking at issues of race, gender, ability in our digital moment. This is a critical time for us as digital scholars, makers, thinkers to directly address racial inequality and unequal access to life, as well as misogyny, global xenophobia, and nationalism. To that end, I'm going to be talking about a call for a new anti-racist platform studies that I'm trying to advance in a new book project I'm working on. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is the outline of this project. Platform studies as it stands, I think, is a wonderfully materially engaged project, but often does not take race into account. It ignores the history of how we got here, whose labor made it possible. It attempts to make an incomplete picture more complete. And I'd cite especially Tracy McMillan Cottom's recent work on the links between racial and digital capitalism and how intimate these are. Cheap components make the internet and innovation possible. What makes cheapness possible? Why would a cutting edge component manufacturer build a plant in Navajo country in 1965, far away from everything else? Because indigenous labor is cheap and because race is fully integrated into digital production. So I'm going to be building on some work I've done on indigenous digital component manufacture and bringing it into the current moment around activism, especially around anti-Asian violence. So as I said, I am very interested in trying to develop a new anti-racist platform studies, and I absolutely love the title of this panel, The New Workers and Geographies of the Digital Economy, because there are, at the same time, new kinds of work and new workers, new geographies. On the other hand, they're exactly the same geographies. Indigenous space is still being used to create value in the digital economy. So I have 3 examples to present today, separated by several decades, that demonstrate how women of color's work, making the material infrastructure for digital media, and it's still women of color's work, was never defined as creative work. It was never defined as work that was worthy of full compensation, and how that undefining, that extraction of status, standing, and value, indeed of identity. Most people are not even aware that it's overwhelmingly women of color's hands that have made their stuff, has led directly to why we do not define women of color's work witnessing and documenting racism online, moderating digital environments and making them usable, and doing community organizing to combat it as work either. Indeed, as Tarleton Gillespie has shown in his research on content moderation, this labor exposes them to punishment from platforms such as banning and suspension. So it's certainly not compensated, it's actually punished. Women of color make our products, and they make our products usable by performing unpaid labor to call out misogyny, thereby making it possible for other women to use platforms, calling out violations of user agreements and hateful behavior. They lead our most effective and important campaigns against racism from their keyboards. And I think since COVID, you see that even more than ever before, how that was always digital labor and always performed by women of color, BLM. I'm going to give some other examples. This is piecework in the classical sense, squeezed in between paid work, reproductive labor, other forms of reproductive labor, and leisure. It is unpaid, but it is productive. It is unpaid not because it is not valuable, but because of the type of person who is doing it, a type of person who has never been treated either as a person or as a worker. Though this is labor of digital repair, exactly the kind of labor that can't be automated or outsourced, as Lee was saying, it overwhelmingly is, with the momentum in Silicon Valley going towards algorithmic and machine learning solutions to what are intrinsically human problems that change really, really rapidly. So in my research, I'm interested in these 3 forms of digital repair performed by women of color. The first, the instinct to record. Darnella Frazier, the woman who made the video of George Floyd and chose to post it to Facebook. Interestingly, she did not send it to a newspaper. She did not send it to a television network. She sent it to Facebook. When she was interviewed about why she made that video and why she put it on Facebook, why she stood there for 10 minutes or longer, completely motionless, capturing this event, she said, I had an instinct to record. It was something I had to do. So I'm very interested in young women of color's labor, witnessing, documenting, and really crafting and disseminating records of racist behavior in public. So Darnella Frazier, one example, but this is happening everywhere all the time. Another kind of digital labor of repair I'm interested in is anti-racist content moderation by women of color as a labor of care. And I'm thinking of that both on video game platforms, I've written about that before, but on social media generally, you know, like reporting Twitter violations, which is rife all the time. Just the everyday act of reporting and clicking and calling something out. And the third one I'm going to talk about a little more today, which is, I'm calling this chapter A Wild Karen, because I took that from a TikTok that a young woman of color wrote, how women of color are mobilizing attention on TikTok and Instagram to create public conversations about issues like sovereignty, who is allowed to be in a public park, who was born where. As always, I believe there are deep and interesting and complex, rich conversations about identity happening on social media, and they're often Gen Z conversations, and where they're the intellectual leaders of that conversation. So I ask, whose labor is labor? Who benefits by defining labor the way we are defining it? Who loses? I see a lot of consistency over the years, but as Gabriela Rosner writes in Critical Fabulations, Reworking the Methods and Margins of Design, design and technology become metaphors for the improvement of economic conditions. Non-designers, and here she's talking about what some of the engineers working on early core memory called little old ladies. So these were the women who actually made core memory by stitching it by hand in the early days of digital memory, or actually just computer memory. Non-designers embattle the forms of resource and knowledge distribution to which they are subjected. So I maintain we have nothing to gain by defining the labor that matters as coming from what Rosner calls certain types of people: creative, self-sufficient individuals molded by the design process. So people who are legible in the world of making. Indeed, I think we've already lost so much by capitulating to that definition of what is labor. I define the women of color labor of digital repair as a relational act of care that keeps platforms usable by flagging hate speech and behavior, again, really in a granular, capillary way, right? This everyday way, by capturing and documenting racist and sexist public behavior using digital tools, thereby creating accountability in spaces where there is no accountability designed. Indeed, where their bodies are at risk, and mobilizing the very social media platforms that often ban them for this work so that they can do this work. I wanted to start by acknowledging the shooting that happened in Atlanta, where several Asian women lost their lives. And I wanted to do so partly to point out the language that is mobilized to bring attention to this event. At Michigan, we're going to have a vigil in our DIAG held by the United Asian American Organizations, UAAO. And I was struck by the way they advertised this on Facebook, which was, they called it a vigil for the lives of Asian workers. This demonstrates, I believe, what is at stake in defining Asian and women of color's relational work, care work, as labor. On March 16th, 8 people were killed by a 21-year-old white man, Robert Aaron Long, who entered their places at work in Atlanta and shot them. Though 6 of these 8 were Asian women, there has been reluctance to call this a hate crime, partly because the killer has not owned this as a motive, and partly because of the politics of Asian visibility, compounded in this case by the stigma attached to sex work. So there was a little conversation going on around, why are their names never put anywhere? Well, other movements have really foregrounded the use of the proper name, like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Why have we not seen their names? Is it that we can't pronounce them? Is it that no one cares about them? Some organizations did put them up, but they were asked to take them down because the families were not able to consent, in addition to which there is a terrible stigma attached to this kind of labor in generally. So I wanted to flag this because they described it as a vigil for the lives of workers, not even the lives of women. So to claim the status of worker is to claim importance in the economy. Women of color's deaths at the hands of the police and of other random shooters are not given as much attention in the digital or political space. You might have seen the Say Her Name hashtag. That came into being precisely to address the way women were not being given visibility on social media around these shootings. The potency of the personal name arrives from the habitual inattention and indifference paid to the lives of people of color after their violent deaths. So this remedy to flag the personal name is unavailable to activists in the API community, when the victims are Asian women who are already illegal, whose safety lay in the ability to go unnoticed as workers who were not citizens, subject to patriarchal norms that stigmatize what they do to sustain exactly those people, touch-starved, alienated, and themselves exploited men, also hoping to be as invisible as possible, slipping into the store, slipping out of the store, not wanting to be known. This kind of care work is neither outsourcing, crowdsourcing, or part of the sharing economy. Instead, it's what I call a tactic of insourcing, the exploitation of people of color, often women, who are part of our nation's illegitimate economy, whose labor is not legal because they are not legal, nor is their labor legitimate. Who else's labor isn't legitimate, and how does this relate to this notion of who does what based on their race and gender? And I really love this book by Atanasaski and Vora. They draw a nice genealogy between what they call the surrogate human effect. So I'll just take a minute so you can read it. It's really brilliant. What I love about this claim is it traces back the effect of the surrogate human, that is to say, the human whose labor can be replaced by a machine, but who was also not quite themselves human, back to the clearing of US land of native bodies, right? Already the discounting of human bodies necessary for the production of the fully human. So they trace the idea of the robot, the slave body, the artificial slave body, as going back to the disappearing of indigenous bodies and creating this disavowal of gendered and racialized labor, meaning labor's labor, it doesn't matter who does it, even though it really does, to support this outsourcing, crowdsourcing, and sharing economy platform. So I saw this and I thought exactly of what we're talking about today. And I thought of this piece of evidence, which I found in 1965, and I'll let you look at it for a minute. Okay, this is a 1965 press release from the Bureau of Indian Affairs that describes why the Bureau was working towards helping the Fairchild Corporation, which was one of the early pioneers in Silicon Valley that made semiconductors and circuits, why they were helping them create a plant on Indian land. So they describe here Indians' natural affinity for precision work, their always already technological nature, and manual dexterity and highly developed sense of spatial relations. It strikes me they were describing Indian workers much as we describe robots today, meaning they are workers that can do the work that is too detail oriented, too dangerous. In the case of high climbing steel structure workers, really too dangerous, or too tedious. So specifically the work of weaving that ought to be done by machines. The labor of Navajo women as circuit builders was meant initially to replace their previous occupations as rug weavers, which the BIA represented as piecework that was precarious work, and to replace it with more modern and reliable forms of capital accumulation, such as working in a factory. Okay, so here is a slide that someone conveniently made for me that brings together different pieces of this brochure that the Fairchild Corporation made to brag about their employment of Indian women and how good they were at making circuits because they were good at making rugs. And what strikes me about this is people have, not without reason, kind of misread this as saying, but the Fairchild Corporation let the Indian women design the circuits. No, they had no ability to design circuits. They were exploiting the visual resemblances between these things. The sad story about this, of course, is that when the American Indian movement took over the plant to insist on unionization, because like other workers that Lilly's talking about, Turkers and such, they were not being paid minimum wage. They were on a reservation, so they weren't seen as citizens. They weren't being paid minimum wage. There were no labor laws that really applied to them. When that protest happened, Fairchild closed down the plant and fired everybody. So that was very precarious work. The idea of replacing, indigenous piecework with modern work just did not work. So I'm going to move ahead to see where we are now. It is still the case that indigenous people are not being given access to some of the platforms that they had been helped to build. So this is just one example of how indigenous creators had been trying to use Instagram, which is really the way to sell craft nowadays, and have been having their posts taken down because sometimes they link them to issues that are going on in their communities, or they may even use words that trigger algorithms that say this is hate speech, and so they're then kicked off of them. And I'm going to end by showing 2 slides of examples of how young women of color are doing the kind of labor, which is also very precarious labor for them, often very dangerous labor. It's piecework, but it's not even paid piecework. However, this work has material consequences in terms of making platforms more visible. So here's an example of a post by a young woman who was having a celebration brunch with her family. They're Asian, and a man who it turned out was a CEO at a tech company. This almost could not be made up, right? Started mocking them and calling them, racial slurs. And so she made a video of it. And she said, please post it, but here's a trigger warning. So she was doing a lot of work, I think, to help the viewer know what to do with this. It did get 1 million views. This guy actually was fired, which doesn't always happen. One of the most beautiful things about this was the allyship of the waitress, who ran over to this man and told him to leave. And I have another one, which, so here's the detail of it. So she gives an explanation of what happened, right? She really does a lot of advocacy work here. Again, unpaid work, very valuable. And the last one I had today is the Wild Karen one, which I think is really an interesting example, again, of how young Gen Z women of color are using their phones to stage these really important conversations about sovereignty, who deserves to be here and why. She and her friend, both young women of color, were in a park, and this woman started yelling at them for picking berries and being, bad. And they got in this fight about who. She told them to go home. She said, you don't belong here, go back to where you came from. And it turns out this is in Canada, she's an American and they are Canadians. So I plan to write more about this. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Lily, for that incisive talk and for demanding about we rethink what counts as digital work and how that count intersects with the calculus of racialization. Unforgettable. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Greig de Peuter. Greig is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at Wilfred Laurier in Waterloo, Ontario, quite near here. He's the recent co-author with Nicole Cohen of a really important study, New Media Unions, Organizing Digital Journalists. And he has a wonderful ongoing research project with the, I think, largely self-explanatory title, Cultural Workers Organize, both a title and a slogan. Greig, we're looking forward very much to hearing you speak this evening.
Thank you so much, Nick, for the introduction. I'm just going to set up my screen sharing. Are you able to see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Great. All right. Well, first, thank you to everyone for coming this evening, especially at a time when Zoom commands so much of our time and attention. It's very much appreciated. I want to also extend gratitude to the organizers of tonight's event, Allison and Josh and Nick and many other people I know behind the scenes to make tonight's conversation happen. Western has always been exceptional at organizing these very timely and topical conferences, and it is wonderful to be here with Lisa and Lily for tonight's discussion. Okay, so problems of work in the digital economy have unprecedented public profile as workers and their allies have drawn them into the spotlight. At the political margins of the digital economy, however, are periodic bursts and generative inklings of new worker organizing. In the research project that Nick mentioned, Cultural Workers Organize, my partners and I have been documenting collective responses to precarity, primarily but not exclusively in media and cultural industries. Our inquiries generally follow three organizational forms. First, unions. In our recent book, Nicole Cohen and I map the ongoing wave of unionization in digital media. Since 2015, journalists have organized at nearly 100 outlets in the US and Canada, using collective bargaining to improve material conditions and to push to make journalism more equitable and accessible. This media labor movement anticipated union inroads into the tech industry. Last year, the 700,000 member union, Communication Workers of America, initiated its campaign to organize digital employees. The second organizational form that we track in our research is so-called alt-labor, or alternative worker associations, which are often, but not always, led by workers without access to unions due to their employment status. Game Workers Unite, the Tech Workers Coalition, and Wage, or Working Artists and the Greater Economy, are some examples. Their activities run from solidarity activism to proposing policy and creating worker tech, like the platform made by Wage to enable artists to demand fees from nonprofit art galleries. In my talk, though, I want to turn to a third organizational form that's used by workers to confront precarity and wider asymmetries in the digital economy: cooperatives. Unlike conventional capitalist businesses, cooperatives are collectively owned and controlled by their members. Several traits of the co-op model suggest its potential for economic democracy. Co-ops hold to principles such as democratic member control and concern for community, and they identify with values like openness and mutual aid and solidarity. Co-ops form not to optimize profit, but to meet a common need and to provide a benefit to a defined member group. Co-ops are predicated on distributing power, one member, one vote, regardless of wealth. Representatives are elected, members participate in decisions, surplus is shared, and co-ops are ultimately accountable to their members. Co-op types range from worker co-ops owned by employees to consumer co-ops to multi-stakeholder co-ops to many other forms. Proponents say that co-ops deliver social benefits like lower income inequality, they redress market failure, extend democracy into everyday economic life, promote more sustainable, low growth, keep wealth in local communities, and improve accountability. Interest in co-ops is resurgent. Class polarization makes them resonant. Business closures amid the pandemic have been met by calls for worker buyouts. And the movement for Black Lives includes the development of cooperatives in its economic justice platform. As a preliminary exploration of how the co-op model might support workers in the digital economy, I'm going to draw on a mix of recent and ongoing collaborative research. This past December, my collaborators and I published a report on a survey of 106 cultural and tech sector co-ops in Canada, the UK, and the US. And we also interviewed about 20 cooperators. I'm also informed by a very much in progress literature review on co-ops and the digital economy. Well, I'll make an argument for co-ops as one component of a wider pro-worker response to problems of work in the digital economy. With my colleague Marisol Sandoval, I remain mindful of their ambivalence, with tensions between co-op self-reliance and public sector provision, between political aspirations and competitive pressures, and between co-ops with weak intent to upset the economic status quo and co-ops that embrace a prefigurative politics of worker control. A lot of the current enthusiasm surrounding co-ops and tech derives from platform cooperativism, a phrase coined in 2014 by media studies academic Trevor Schultz of the New School in New York. At the time, platform cooperativism was a counter-narrative to the commercial sharing economy. Now, it's more likely to be set against platform capitalism or big tech. And so the platform cooperativism imaginary is burdened with an impressive crowd of foes: precarious gig work, surveillance capitalism, free labor, data extractivism, discriminatory practices, black box technology, quasi-monopoly, accountability gaps, venture capital vultures, and much more. What platform cooperativism lacks in analytical precision, it makes up for as a mobilizing concept. In a way, platform cooperativism was a pitch for pitches. It encouraged progressive technologists to experiment with the creation of platform co-ops, defined by Ed Mayo as businesses that, like the established tech platforms, use digital channels to enable people to meet their needs or solve a problem by connecting individuals or assets, but with the difference that they operate on a more equitable model, with democratic control and collective ownership. The platform cooperativism proposition clearly struck a chord. A stream of conferences, reports, online resources, a research institute, institutional partnerships, and grants from the likes of Google propelled the platform cooperativism brand well beyond, while still closely tied to, its Manhattan crucible. While currently leading the conversation on tech and co-ops, platform cooperativism does not entirely capture the range of co-op theory and practice in digital domains. For one, not all tech co-ops make platforms, but also co-op proponents do not necessarily embrace the label uncritically. In a solidarity critique, Marisol Sandoval questions, for example, the political implications of platform cooperativism's apparent accommodation to a neoliberal vocabulary of business, markets, and entrepreneurship. To provide a glimpse of the emerging co-op landscape in the digital economy, I want to flag some examples, mostly from the survey that I mentioned at the outset. We built a database of about 500 co-ops in cultural and tech sectors in Canada, the US, and the UK. I'll give a quick aerial view of a handful of fields where worker co-ops in particular are most present. First, media and cultural co-ops. Examples include Detroit's Means TV, a worker-owned video streaming platform, Ampled, a multi-stakeholder music streaming co-op, and a Montreal game studio fittingly named Co-op. Canada's platform co-op exemplar is Stocksy, a stock photography co-op which Juliet Shore has found to offer considerably better than average royalties to its 1,000 artists. And second are worker co-ops in digital design. Examples include Seattle-based Story 2 Designs, a 5-member people of color-led co-op which provides web development services for social justice organizations. And in the UK, London's Outlandish, a worker co-op that builds websites, among other services, and offers co-working space to fledgling co-ops, and also runs a free Learn to Code program. And third are freelancer co-ops. These unite self-employed workers. SMART, a worker co-op, offers online services to support freelancers in managing their livelihoods. Members retain independence in their everyday work, but they can become legal employees of the co-op, a kind of workaround that enables them to access social protections that otherwise wouldn't be available to them because of their employment status. And then fourth are gig work or on-demand co-ops. Studies of global crowd work, from the ILO to the Oxford Internet Institute, regularly note platform co-ops as a strategy to improve platform transparency, pay, and worker voice. But to my knowledge, there is not yet a public digital piecework co-op, though there have been some calls for one. There are, however, examples of gig work co-ops, such as New York's Up and Go, a client bookings app serving a federation of worker-owned cleaning co-ops. Up and Go members, who are primarily Latin American women, shaped the design of the platform, including deciding against allowing reviews of individual workers, only of the service generally. And lastly, are nascent data co-ops. The driver's seat cooperative, for instance, proposes to give gig economy drivers control over which data are collected about them, can use data analytics to improve their work routine, and may monetize pooled data by selling it to, say, municipal governments looking for insights into urban mobility patterns. These kinds of co-op tech experiments are proliferating, yet for the moment, platform co-ops are relatively few, and many fail to leap past concept. Perhaps the most built out microtask co-op upstart, Loconomics of San Francisco, shuttered in 2020. And this raises the issue of challenges to further co-op formation. It's common among co-op scholars to nominate low public awareness of the co-op model as a big barrier to new co-op formation. And likewise, our survey respondents identified raising public awareness of co-ops as the top priority to promote new co-ops. The co-op model, claim its proponents, is marginalized in business education, in publicly funded new business development services, and is effectively locked out, as one cooperator put it, from incubators, a key site of new business formation in the tech world. Beyond the awareness challenge, platform co-ops that attempt to clone dominant platforms will clearly confront the structural challenge of capitalist competition, going up against incumbents with outsized network effects. But the barrier to co-op development that probably receives most commentary is lack of access to capital, particularly when co-ops are starting up. Earlier, I mentioned the platform co-op Stocksy. But if Stocksy is held up as an example of what's possible, there's a caveat. In its first year, Stocksy was funded by a $1.3 million loan from two of the co-op's founders, who had sold a previous successful stock photo business to Getty Images. Without deep pockets, the funding conversation in many upstart tech co-ops will eventually arrive at venture capital. But the dominant venture capital apparatus and co-op principles clash, where outside investors expect proportional influence proportional to stakes. The co-op model insists on one member, one vote, regardless of wealth. And where the venture capitalist model seeks to ultimately sell the business or take it public, for co-ops, the destination is worker, user, or community control. So cooperators have been trying to confront these challenges by organizing cooperative infrastructure, or institutions and practices to support co-op formation. Raising awareness of the co-op model, for example, platform co-op advocates have created a co-op development kit. And in keeping with the cooperative principle of cooperation among cooperatives, tech co-ops also enact mutual aid. Outlandish, for instance, started CoTech, a support network of UK-based digital co-ops. And Co-op Cycle, a bike courier co-op, combines copyleft politics and co-op solidarity, sharing the code for its delivery app among federated groups, making it easier to start a similar co-op in other cities. To deal with the co-op model's marginalization from tech incubators, co-op advocates have launched their own co-op focused incubators, like Boston's Start.coop, Australia's Incubator.coop, and Unfound, a partnership between Cooperatives UK and the co-op sector magazine Stir to Action. So these initiatives not only reflect cooperators' impulse to self-organize, but they also replicate many of tech's dominant cultural practices. Co-op proponents, though, are also imagining larger scale solutions for funding startup platform co-ops. In one proposal, new co-ops would be initially financed by institutional social investors, say co-op associations and credit unions, who'd provide the equivalent of venture capital to support the co-op as it scales. And then later, mutual shares or community shares would be issued to co-op members, and then the co-op, hypothetically in a surplus position, begins to repay the original social investors. Others propose that co-ops that move through co-op incubators could share back a portion of future surpluses to support further co-op development, a kind of solidarity economy logic of cooperative capital. Now, the co-ops that I mentioned earlier point to a small but vibrant co-op landscape emerging at the margins of the digital economy. But what do we actually know about the conditions of work inside these kinds of co-ops? Here, I'll flag a few findings from our survey of 106 co-ops, a sample that, to be clear, includes both tech and cultural sector co-ops. Among our most striking findings was that virtually 90% report being somewhat or extremely satisfied with their working conditions generally, a culture of work in which people feel supported, have a voice, and self-determination were consistently highlighted as benefits of working cooperatively. Digging deeper, though, reveals some concerning findings. On compensation, for example, nearly 45% reported that pay was below industry standard. And one of the top organizational challenges identified by co-ops was cash flow, raising questions about business stability. But beyond the challenges of sustaining a co-op are also the challenges of starting up an alternative business, which requires time and money, resources that are not evenly distributed. Nearly 3/4 of the co-ops report relying significantly on the support of member labor during the startup phase. Given the strained financial position that co-ops often find themselves in during their early days, this member labor, it is safe to assume, is often unpaid or underpaid. Our survey reveals some further ways in which co-ops in our study mirror inequalities associated with their conventional corporate counterparts. Nearly 18% of the co-ops describe themselves as not at all racially diverse, and 52.6% describe themselves as only slightly racially diverse. Juliet Shore writes, if platform co-ops are to succeed without reproducing their own more privileged class, race, and gender homogeneousness, founders and early participants must be highly attuned to subtle social dynamics that valorize the practices and traits of dominant groups, end quote. But the issue is also who's in the room from the outset. Cultural sector co-ops we researched may offer some lessons here for new digital co-ops. Wary of informality, the artist co-op Value, for example, instituted co-op policies that limit each member to only recommending one new member, and that require that a minimum of half of the members are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. If you don't do that right off the bat, says one Value member, you never get there because you've built a culture that is not friendly. Now, historically, co-ops and unions have been typically thought of as, strategically at least, either-or organizational forms. But in digital cooperativism, we see inklings of their convergence, and this deserves to be pushed further. Part of the need is cultural. Labor movement language is vital to counteract the saturation, especially in platform cooperativism, of tech business terminology, from startups to scaling to exit to venture capital. Moreover, tech co-ops can themselves unionize. The union co-op model was promoted years ago by the steelworkers and the world's largest and most controversial co-op group, Mondragon. In our survey, 20% of the unions, of the co-ops rather, were unionized co-ops. Worker co-ops that join a union express solidarity with and membership in a larger worker movement. But unionizing a co-op is much more than a symbolic gesture. Union membership may offset the pressure on co-ops for worker owners to, borrowing from Marx's well-known critique of co-ops, become their own capitalists. A union in a worker co-op allows for struggle within the worker-owner position, where union membership can, as one union co-op advocate put it, give worker owners a space to wear their employee hat in collective negotiations over pay and conditions, end quote. Moreover, a union contract with legal clout affords far greater precision than somewhat abstract, if well-meaning, cooperative principles. In the co-op tech space, there are a growing number of examples of union involvement in platform co-ops. The Platform Cooperativism Consortium, for example, is supporting a handful of pilots, one of which has the backing of the Service Employees International Union. Other examples of union co-op partnerships include that between the UK Union Community and the co-op IndieCube, which provides support services to self-employed and freelance workers. And in California, the union United Health Workers West has supported the creation of an app, Nurses Can Cooperative, which has become the union's first union-backed platform co-op for vocational nurses. But the cooperative tradition, varied as it is, also has much to contribute to the politics of unionism, including pushing unions to envision what a worker-centered economy might look like in practice. Such conversations of unions and co-ops, in certain circles, begin or end with the question of what Marx thought about co-ops. Minson G, in a recent article, resolves something of that open question, suggesting that perhaps it is not this or that organizational form that is sacrosanct, but the question of whether the organizational form builds class consciousness and, we could add, fosters worker power. In economies past, co-ops have shown that they are not inherently transformational, but with intentionality and care, co-ops have another chance in the digital economy to prove their transformative potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. It's really special to be able to hear such a carefully researched and thoughtfully considered examination of platform co-ops.
Thank you, Nick.
So this concludes the presentation section of the event. But now we move to what is the equally or perhaps even more important aspect, that of discussion between the audience and the panelists. And I would like to encourage you now, if you haven't already done so, to enter your questions using the Q&A button. I see that we do have a couple of questions lined up right now. So the first question, which is from Vicky Mayer, is what is our ethical responsibility to pay or compensate precarious research subjects for the time and info that they give us? And I think I'll treat this as a question that's open to all of you may have thoughts on this, but I know, Lisa, you had some observations to make on this based on your own experience.
Yeah, I think that one might have been meant for Lilly, and I just typed mine, but it was just to say, like, precarious people don't need gift cards because they often can't use them anywhere. Because at least in Navajo land, they don't have those stores. So you have to pay people in cash, which is what I did when I went there, and you have to pay them right that minute. Some people don't have any way to get mail, you know. It's a sign of, I think, trust and respect to pay people in cash and to do them right away. And I know our universities hate to do that, but if you can possibly afford it, I think it really made a huge difference for me.
Lilly, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, this actually came up pretty recently in a conversation with the organizers in Turk. So there's a kind of worker issue that was coming up. We were seeing, they were seeing a bunch of workers facing, and they wanted to gather more information about it. And I'd kind of volunteered to do some interviews for that project. And when I brought up paying, one of the things that really surprised, like paying people for, interviewing, because that's what I'm trained to do. It's like, well, I'm going to interview, I'm going to take your time, they said that this actually kind of made, they felt like it was weird because it would make them feel like test subjects, because they're actually working on a platform where they actually are paid to be research subjects day in, day out. And then this interview was supposed to be for, kind of informing the organizing process. And so like the idea was more like, well, okay, like you can tell us what happened with your account in this way, and you also should have a stake in what the project does with that information. Like it's not kind of being done for publication. So one of the ways I kind of made sense of that is that sometimes maybe the money can actually make it feel extractive and maybe displace a different conversation about what do you want? What is this the research labor that would actually be helpful for your goals? But that said, this was very specific to the context of this group of people, the relationship that they've had historically with academics, just extracting from them like all day and like writing research grants to do research on them all day. And so I think like there might be other research subjects who want really different things. But to me, like just thinking through Vicky's question made me think about what what is a broader sense of accountability that we can have that isn't just about payment.
Great. Did you want to come in on this, Greg?
I guess I would only add to the points that Lilly and Lisa have made, that in the context of our Cultural Workers Organized project, at least, I think one of our objectives is to strive to develop relations of reciprocity with the organizations that we're researching. So utilizing, for example, grant money to organize events to help them to organize, or utilizing grant resources to produce other mobilizing resources, freely circulating the results of our research, like the co-op report that I spoke to today, to co-op developers to try to get it into the hands of potential cooperators. I'm not saying that that's an easy resolution to the tensions that folks were describing earlier, but it is, I think, an example of attempting to do this work with a spirit of reciprocity.
We have a question now from Dilara Bezel, and it's a question for Lilly. It says, how do you see workers organize, communicate across the hierarchies that are created within a certain company or ecosystem, particularly workers who are positioned closer to the top of that hierarchy, but still in worker for status? And then in brackets indicates that this is also a question for Greig in the context of co-ops. So maybe you first, Lilly, and then Greig and Muslim.
Sure, this is a question that's very close to my heart because for 10 years, when I was writing about Amazon Mechanical Turk, I focused a lot on the relationship between the kind of programmers and employers and Turkers rather than just focusing on representing Turkers. And I talked about this a little bit in my talk that the kind of tech culture practices that Greig talks about, Greig talked about a lot in his talk, and I know has been something that Lisa has written a lot about. They, as Lisa described, cast certain kinds of work as tedious and menial and not worth doing, but then also say things. I've heard, tech entrepreneur person say, oh, well, as people need money. As long as I'm providing money, that's kind of all that matters, right? And so I published kind of arguing that tech workers at the top of the hierarchy actually benefited from the kind of exploitation and making labor cheap of, Amazon Mechanical Turk workers to kind of give them, to consolidate their image as entrepreneurial tech geniuses and not just managers of 10,000 person factories. But one of the things that's happened in the last decade is there's groups like Tech Worker Coalition that have been organizing in tech companies, and in San Diego, I'm involved with Tech Worker Coalition. When we first started trying to transition Turkopticon to worker governed, we actually, a student I worked with, Sim, and I we were really trying to do teach Turkers how to code and not have them rely on tech workers from that kind of upper part of the pyramid, because we really wanted Turkers to have autonomy. And then we kind of realized that, man, learning full stack software engineering, the databases and all that, that's an immense demonstration of social wealth being invested in someone's education. And we live in a country in the United States where that wealth, only the very privileged people get that kind of time to learn those skills. And so when I talked about how Tech Worker Coalition workers have been doing a lot of the coding, I think mutual aid principles of the sort that Dean Spade writes about with solidarity, not charity, were kind of intuitive for us, not intuitive, but well-informed by lots of reading people like Lisa and feminist studies. But, it's these are not tech workers who are coming because they think they can innovate something for Turk workers. There are HCI researchers who sometimes treat Turkers like that, and it's a really big problem. These are tech workers who are more, they understand that their industry is extractive and they don't want to support that. And one of their ways of building kind of cross-sector tech worker solidarity is to contribute to the maintenance of this code. And it's not I'm volunteering, and so yeah, I can't help you until 2 months from now because I don't feel like it kind of relationship. It's a relationship where they and the Turk workers in the project, there can be critique and feedback going in both directions. We also actually, this fundraiser, the link that I posted is from a Tech Worker for Tech Worker Solidarity fundraising campaign. We're actually trying to get tech workers from that upper part of the pyramid to actually redistribute the kind of extracted wealth that they've accumulated to support Turk worker organizing. And so those kinds of solidarity projects also become a place of political education for tech workers in all parts of the sector, in addition to building direct solidarity relationships that allow them to do things that they couldn't otherwise do. I hope that yeah, I'm happy to clarify or expand on anything.
Thank you, Lilly. So Greig, how does this issue of communication and organization across worker hierarchies look from the platform co-op perspective, or the cultural workers organize optic?
I'm glad that Lilly brought up Tech Workers Coalition, because I think that the attention that Tech Workers Coalition pays to cross-class organization and the difficulty of organizing across strata and across occupational segments is not a conversation that I tend to see and hear that often in the platform cooperativism space. So I think that's one of the other reasons why there needs to be more linkages being made between the cooperativist circle and unions and some of these alternative worker associations, because I think that their critiques could be deepened, I think, through learning from some of the organizing that Tech Workers Coalition has been doing.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, do you want in on this one? No? Okay. A question from an anonymous attendee. It's for Greig. Have you considered expanding your research to include questions about the workings of co-ops in countries like Cuba, where worker co-ops are becoming a larger part of the overall economy?
No, it's not something that I've actively thought about, but I certainly would be keen to explore more international sites of cooperativism in the cultural sector and in the tech sector. One of the places that I guess I have thought about expanding this to is Argentina. And also Brazil. There are researchers there who are undertaking similar studies as the ones that we have, kind of mapping out the kind of landscape of platform cooperativism there, but not specifically in Cuba.
I guess also we have comrades in Italy, which has been perhaps the major laboratory for the introduction of co-ops with very mixed results, right?
That's right, like social care co-ops and so on, and that's, I think, a really important example and reason why our perspective on co-ops is so ambivalent, that those social care co-ops came to fill a gap that was left through neoliberal policy and the withdrawal of the public sector.
All right. Lily, Lisa, any observations you'd like to throw in on the co-op question at this point? No? Okay. All right. So a question from Linda Huber. I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on the potential impacts on worker power of the shifts towards remote online work, e.g. from the pandemic and continued platformization of white-collar knowledge work, etc. Without shared office space, are we less capable of organizing, more susceptible to surveillance? Are there any positives? All right, so that's a question on a very live issue and also quite a broad one. And one, who would like to start us off on that? The question of the current moment of pandemic remote online work and its consequences on for labor politics. Lily, it looks as if
sure. I think Greig, maybe you had your hand up too, right? I don't have.
Go
I can just start it off because this is a very hard question. I don't have like the take. It's funny because I was thinking about Linda's question, and it's a good one. And like Amazon Mechanical Turk workers are organizing in exactly this situation. Like they've been in this situation for a long time. And I know when Sherry spoke a couple of weeks ago at another event, that's one of the things that she talked about was, yeah, like there are workers, like workers like find ways to find each other. There are online forums where people talk and they share memes and they like make friends, and they, you know, like there is a kind of digital space, you know, placemaking that happens, but all of that is really hard to keep out of the view of, yeah, like surveillance. Like if somebody, you know, like Amazon, I know Amazon was monitoring Turkopticon's discussion forums, for example, because like they would sometimes email us and be like, we heard this thing. And when I compare it to organizing at the university, like there's, yeah, like at the university you can go door to door, lab to lab, but actually a lot of humanities and more like social science workers at the university also are like working from home and working from cafes and are also kind of dispersed. So I'm not sure I can make a kind of quantitative judgment. But I do think that anytime the practices suddenly change, you know, it takes time to figure out what the new connectivities that are afforded by that transformation are. But the surveillance is real. Yeah, what do others think?
Yeah, Lisa, you're nodding on that.
I've read appalling things about Amazon spying on workers. And maybe you can say if those are all true, they're just the really bad. I mean, I think all the tech companies are bad, but Amazon seems especially unscrupulous about that.
It's just the world I don't know, we do what we can where we are, you know, but there are a lot of like person to person relationships and connections that are not so visible by just like who's posting, you know, in the publicly viewable spaces. So and I know that gig workers, like driver workers, often have like WhatsApp groups that they form. My sense is that that's a little bit harder to surveil than some of the web-based posting, but I think there's a lot of work to do figuring out what these less surveillable ways of communicating are. I'm glad Linda asked this question. I think we should be thinking very hard about this.
Greg, your observations on this one?
I guess I could make some comments in reference to the research project that I mentioned at the start of my talk, the collaborative work with Nicole Cohen on the digital journalists organizing movement. And although our research was completed prior to the pandemic, one of the most impressive things is that outlets have continued to unionize throughout the pandemic. Despite the fact that in our conversations with journalists and organizers that, you know, all of the conversations at the early stages of the organizing were face-to-face and one-on-one, and this is core to the organizing approach and philosophy, it seems as though that movement has adapted very rapidly to these conditions, and it is not slowed, it would seem, successful unionization drives, at least in digital media, and that I think is a cause for a lot of optimism.
We'll speak to that a little bit. I think that this is a whole dissertation, Linda, because it's really well laid out. I mean, you could definitely gather data on this, and you know, the groups I'm studying have always been online, right? And their issue is that they don't see themselves as workers sometimes. Like there's a kind of fleeting consciousness of exploitation. And sometimes labor comes in, but it's often talked about as emotional labor, which is kind of the self-discounting term, which people are using. So I think what might be happening as a result of the pandemic is really widespread class resentment, which might be leading to a little more organizing, just as a kind of ambient condition, you know, that it's so clearly broken and messed up and it's so unequal and so much more so that might be a kind of indirect effect, right, of that. But yeah, the people I study, they're like way behind the other groups that the platform capitalists are looking at, platform capitalism scholars are looking at, because they have a different issue, which I think is more endemic to kind of reproductive labor.
A question for Greg from Marianne Boucher-Laporte. So Greg, how did you select case study organizations in the Sharing Like We Mean It project? I saw only one artist-run film video co-op, but there is a very strong history of these organizations across Canada and many more like organizations.
Well, to build the sample of co-ops, or the population rather of co-ops that we used in our survey, we began with the membership list of cooperative associations. That was a key resource. And another was the Internet of Ownership directory that's maintained by the Platform Cooperativism Consortium. There were a number of Canadian artists co-ops, film equipment co-ops as well, and others that were a part of our sample. I think that we had a total of at least 200 co-ops across co-op and tech sectors in the Canadian branch of our sample of co-ops. In terms of the longer case studies that we profiled in the report itself, we were somewhat more selective. I think that we paid a lot of attention to the case of Value, the Vancouver Artist Labor Union, because of the inventiveness of its model, that it was an artists co-op, but it was also a unionized co-op. And it was very committed to making connections between the cooperative tradition and the union movement. So those were some of the kind of criteria that came into play too, but mostly through the membership list of the co-op associations.
So from an anonymous attendee, this question is for Lilly. Yes, this question is for Lilly. Did you also see a lack of solidarity between workers when you started Turk Opticon? I'm surprised to see how involved the Turkers were in your project. In my research about platform workers, the main issue I see is a lack of solidarity, especially among online workers. They see themselves as competitors and cannot even imagine organizing, or those who do it as a side activity don't identify themselves as platform workers.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, definitely there's all kinds of lack of solidarity in all the workplaces I'm familiar with in my university and Amazon Mechanical Turk. And you know, I've certainly like read studies that people have done where, you know, they make a similar, you know, like there's a paper by Wilfred Laurier where it was about identity in Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. And I wrote him about this. I was like, well, okay, one of the problems with like the snapshot model of studying platform work is that we're assuming that, you know, like we're taking a snapshot of where people's consciousness is at. And we're also making the claim that this is that our methods have given us insight into the characteristics of a group, which is like very kind of like, you know, like there's like the history of anthropology there. But the way I look at it is like, if you have, I mean, like most workers may not have this attitude. Like there are a lot of reasons why people have to compete to earn a living on that platform. But there, you know, like when I met Sherry at that workshop, you know, there were like 40 people at that workshop, 40 workers at that workshop, maybe like 4 of them like stuck around for the next workshop. And then, you know, like Sherry and others, like they do one-on-ones and they find the ones that do feel like, yeah, you know, I am helping other workers find tasks. There are friendship groups, certainly among Turkers, where people do engage in mutual aid. You can build on like the good sense that people do have and the ways that they do, it's not actually as individualistic as they have. Another problem is that when people describe what their lives are like in interviews, they're using the discourses that are available to them from culture, but people do things that they don't know how to represent in words, like affect theory has taught us that. So I think one of the reasons I think organizing is really important and interesting to me as an ethnographer is that instead of trying to represent what people are like, I instead tuning into all the different ways that people can come into being with each other, and that they already are, and then, you know, help and figuring out like, how do we build on the good that's already there?
So these questions of who identifies as a worker and who's identified as a platform worker. And this seems to go to the heart of some of the issues that you were raising, Lisa.
Yeah, I think, I remember meeting Lilly at a conference on digital labor in 2008 at NYU when it was such a new thing and people weren't even sure what to call it. The gig work wasn't a thing yet. And I think invisible work was kind of a thing as an artifact from other fields that got pressed into. And so in such a short amount of time, it's gone from this slightly speculative, smaller thing to everything. Digital labor is everything, I think, as Linda was saying in the chat, like it now has overshadowed everything else. So I think the ground, what is it, the foreground and the background have kind of switched places. And I think cognitively people are trying to catch up to that. So, I think as Lily is saying, people come into being together, and when they start to see themselves as workers, like you will know, and they will tell you, but that doesn't mean they're not workers, right? It just, it's just one aspect of the thing. But I think the issue of conflict and competition is a real thing, right? I mean, part of the reason I don't see it in the people I'm looking at is that no one does think they're a worker. Like no one's competing to work for free. So that's not an issue.
Greg, I saw you nodding at Lily's remarks about the problems of taking a snapshot of platform workers and basing an analysis on that. Was there something that you wanted to add on that at all?
Since you caught it, I guess what I was thinking about in that moment that Lily was speaking was it brought me back to our study of journalist organizing again, and thinking about how networks of friendship and care in the workplace were such vital conditions of possibility for these organizing drives, going back to the point that you made too about affect theory and that kind of condition of possibility for this movement. That's why I was nodding.
Okay, great. So let's see. Yeah, so there seems to be just a slight pause in the flow of questions in the question and answer box. So I'm going to take advantage of this and ask my own question here. In introducing this event, I mentioned the problematic that had really informed the series of the sort of thesis that AI and big data and platform work might manifest in significantly different ways between large metropolitan hubs and more peripheral zones. We were thinking of smaller cities. Here in Ontario, Canada, the point of comparison would be between what the situation of digital work in cities like Toronto might be as compared with the smaller towns in southern Ontario, such as that of which University of Western Ontario is located in. I'd just like to ask you maybe to circle back to this question of the geographies of digital piecework or digital work generally, and ask first of all whether this seems meaningful and important to you. Lisa has already suggested it's sort of the more things change, the more they stay the same in terms of some of the racially territorialized aspects of this. But I wondered if you thought that this conversation about big cities at the margin had any meaning in terms of the geography of work. Lily, it looks as if you're on the verge of saying something.
She wanted to say something too. I mean, I can only speak anecdotally on this, but certainly a lot of the Turk workers that I know actually do live in really rural areas. And and it makes sense. Like if the cost of transporting yourself to a job is very high, then working from home, like there's something really appealing about that. But then I also know people who've Turked because they have disabilities and they live in cities, but cities with really bad public transportation, or they're dealing with discrimination and finding other jobs. And so with Amazon Mechanical Turk, like for all of its problems, like nobody was gonna fire you because no one was gonna, like you could like work out the schedule like a little bit more flexibly than with your boss, and like they didn't see you at the interview, you know. And so it kind of makes me think about your question about geography a little bit differently, like rather than like a country-city relationship, kind of a question of like mobilities, like who can be mobile to a job out of the house or a job in the Uber and like or a job out in the office, and who can't. And so then like people with like certain kinds of disabilities, people who have elder care responsibilities, childcare responsibilities, of which there's tons of people. Like Sherry actually talks publicly about how she put her three kids through school doing Turk work. You know, and people in rural areas, like all kind of can be seen through that like mobility and like, you know, a mobility justice frame maybe. But that's just the first thought on your question.
Yeah, really valuable one. Lisa?
Yeah, as Lily was talking, I was thinking about how I did see an actual picket line in front of the Whole Foods here in Ann Arbor by the Alabama chapter of Amazon. And I swear to God, most people had no idea why they were there, because they don't know that Whole Foods and Amazon have anything to do with each other. But they were on the picket line. They were right on the main street, which is where the Whole Foods was. And I was just impressed by what it took to get people physically during a pandemic to strike in front of a Whole Foods in Michigan. But what I was going to say about the people that I was talking about in regards to locale is that, you know, for many years, people of color, queer people, as Elise said, disabled people have really relied on the internet for community, especially when they live in small towns where there isn't going to be an organizational meeting about such and such, or there isn't going to be a public conversation about this new movie or whatever. And so I have seen people say, you know, I think we need to we need to kind of unfuck the internet because this is all I have, right? I don't live in New York. I'm the only queer Black person in my town. You know, and I really rely on Tumblr. I really rely on Twitter or whatever it is. So, you know, for other people, it's just an annoyance when it's unusable and toxic and just full of bullshit and no one's enforcing the rules. But for some people, that's a big difference. That's a big issue. It's a big difference. I think Mary Gray's written really well about that. And out in the country, I mean, the internet isn't everything for people who are, you know, people who are marginalized, but it matters. You know, it's a resource, a different kind of resource. So people who can't afford, as Lily was saying, like to move to the metropole, to be engaged with the kind of culture they want. And there's this kind of reverse migration of highly skilled tech workers who are moving to massive mansions in like exurbs in the country because they can. And the people who can't afford to move are people doing physical gig work like delivering food. So there are these kind of cross-cutting geographies, as you were saying in your call, which are just really rapidly moving and very racialized.
Yeah, I love that, cross-cutting geographies that rapidly move. Very poignant that what you mentioned, that picket line in front of our Whole Foods in Ann Arbor in solidarity with the Amazon workers organizing in Alabama. I guess many of us are on tenterhooks waiting to see how that turns out. Greg, how does the question of geography look in terms of the projects that you're working on?
A couple potential points come to mind. One is that many of the papers that are unionizing in the United States are small community papers, and there are also potential candidates for being converted into community-owned outlets, and there are some developments on that front. So I think that's one way in which we could make the connection. Another way of responding is thinking about how the notion or brand of platform cooperativism circulates globally through a series of workshops. and through a series of pilot projects. And I don't have this kind of well thought through at this point, but I think that there's a kind of way of understanding technology. There's a lexicon that is saturated in Silicon Valley discourse that migrates with the platform cooperativism concept, and I wonder if that is a unique geographical consequence of the wide uptake of the category of platform cooperativism.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So our Q&A box is filling up again, and from an anonymous attendee, an important question. As an early stage PhD student interested in researching digital labor platforms today, could you share one piece of advice you would tell your students? More would be great. Thank you for the work that you all do. All right. So this is one of those stand and deliver questions. Your one or more pieces of advice for an early stage PhD platform researcher. Who'd like to go first? Don't all speak at once.
Okay,
All right. Yep.
stick my neck out.
Good.
So take this with a grain of salt, because I don't know you, I don't know how you're situated, and I appreciate your openness to hearing our advice. But my apologies in advance. This does not apply, but I think for me, putting your research, if you want to maybe studying platform workers, putting your research, kind of situating yourself as somebody in relation to the platform labor. Are you a consumer of it? Are you, somebody who did it? And two, how, because of those different positionalities, you can, as trained in anthropology, we learn to unpack how we ourselves have been made as people through our access to consuming other people's labor or doing labor for other people, and the cultural systems that help us make sense of it. Two, is there a way that you can do the work where you're accountable to some kind of platform labor group that actually has enough bandwidth to meaningfully incorporate the kinds of contributions you might make, and to has enough bandwidth to kind of deal with you? Because, we as academics, we love to go and understand stuff, and then people are like, I didn't really want to be watched right now. It's a very real thing. And so if you kind of work with a more organized group, they can be a little bit more real with you about where you can actually be helpful. And then the third is by no means universal, but for me, I found a lot of help in reading kind of economic anthropology and economic sociology on top of kind of cultural studies approaches to race and gender and class, because it helps, it helps me understand how geography and kind of person-to-person social relationships and affect and political histories are all shaping how people do their work and what it means to them. Yeah, so I don't know, I'm interested in hearing what others have to say about this.
Okay, well, you gave plenty there. That's Greg, would you like to have a go at this?
So this is PhD student advising on platform labor. I think that my simple advice, and just I saw it in the chat, obviously read Marxist work too. That's precisely what I was going to say, or more specifically, to look into the notion of workers' inquiry and ask the workers that you hope to research what their questions are, and how you can aid in responding to those questions, so that it is a co-research project rather than one that is necessarily undertaken only by an academic from the outside. So workers' inquiry.
I would say to a dissertation student, when using the term labor, define it carefully and look to see who benefits from what kind of definition. Because this is a term which doesn't have a simple, straightforward or commonly accepted way. And so I would add to looking at Marx, who is obviously the kind of text on labor, look at feminist work. Like people whose ideas about labor have been excluded for a reason. And usually because they're threatening to those paradigms which benefit specific kinds of people who usually are already considered workers, right? So I'm not saying these are intentional exclusions. It's just the way that disciplines build themselves is by excluding things. So, when you set up your research question, make sure that you have a definition of labor that isn't inadvertently fighting with other things that you're trying to do, right? So that's all. Just make sure you like the term, you like the way you're using the term yourself before you continue to go.
I think we have time just to squeeze in one more question from the box, but because we're getting close to the end, I'm going to ask you all to be succinct on this one. And so the question from an anonymous attendee is, in your experience, working with digital remote workers that are attempting to organize unions, what are some specific asks that a union can advocate for that would materially help racialized people or other marginalized communities? For example, arguing for more sick days, etc. Lisa, would you like to take this first?
Gosh, I wish I knew the answer to that. I feel like such an important question, but so hard to answer. I don't know. Is there anything from Turk that seems to work, Lily?
I mean, my thought with that question was that, it really just, I think it comes out in the specifics of who's organizing. Racialization helps us see patterns in whose labor is counted or valued or not. But it can also help us see patterns in like specific kinds of workplaces about specific kinds of harms or hierarchies that people are dealing with. But what it's going to look like for a driver in, even what it looks like in a driver in a city that's got a lot of, racial diversity versus, like a town that doesn't, would look really, if I think about concrete examples, it would look really different. So I think this is one of those places where workers inquiry, specifically working with workers and helping, find ways to kind of sustain and legitimate those demands is the kind of work that we need to do rather than judging what the content of those demands should be. Mm-hmm. I think my talk was about anything. It's we should not be offering the content of the demands.
Yeah, I'm thinking of just really kind of traditional organizing, Grace Lee Boggs and her husband, Jimmy Boggs, they were, Asian and Black couple in Detroit who did a lot of organizing workers. But they had to really fight a bunch of racism within the ranks, right? And, kind of movement build a lot, but it really kind of brought into relief how much you can do for racialized populations if you're willing to be a leader. And that's not something everybody can do, either because they have children or for whatever reason. So, yeah.
Okay. I could throw one thing in there. Asad Haider has a book called Mistaken Identity, and whatever you think of the book, one of the things that stuck out to me was you talking about the Communist Party in the 40s and how there's a kind of racialized division of labor where the white workers were supposed to do anti-racist work with white people, and then the Black workers were supposed to kind of work, organize with Black workers to resist kind of the efforts of Black middle class and bourgeoisie efforts to kind of dilute the solidarity between workers of different races. So that's just one small example of how organizing can be informed by understanding these racializing dynamics.
So Greg, comment on this.
I think just to hear to both Lily and Lisa's comments.
Okay, good. So we are now closing in on closing time after what I have to say I found to be an exceptionally full and rewarding discussion for which I'd like to thank our panelists, but I would also like to thank everyone in the audience who asked these penetrating questions. There are a couple of three finishing announcements that I'd like to make. The first, perhaps the most important, is that for those of you who've enjoyed this event and want another opportunity to engage with our panelists, there may be an opportunity to do so if there's still spaces in the workshop that we are going to hold at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. This is a planned small group discussion, and I imagine Josh is going to put it into the chat details about that. So if you would be interested in renewing the conversation tomorrow morning, yes, I can see that Josh has put a message there. This would be a really great opportunity to go deeper into some of the issues that have been raised here. So two other announcements about big data at the margins. We're co-sponsoring an event with Matt Stahl, the current Rogers Chair in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies here at Western. And the title of this event is Making Poverty Pay, Digital Creditors, Gentrifying Landlords and Financial Capitalism Today, with Rob Atkin and Suzanne Soderberg. And that is going to be held on April the 14th at 7 p.m. I don't know if, again, Joshua, if you'd be able to put the details of that into the chat. And then after that, Big Data at the Margins is going to be taking a break for the summer, where we'll all be doing wonderful things that we haven't been able to do for months and months. But we will be back in the fall with our next panel, which is called The Right to Repair, Legal and Policy Struggles Over Digital Tools and Consumer Rights, featuring Frank Pasquale, Steve Jackson, and Alyssa Santivani on October the 7th, 2021. So I think at this point, I'd just like to say once again, a big thank you to Lilly and Lisa and Greg for giving us such a fascinating discussion, and very best wishes to all of you in the audience until we see you again, whether it's tomorrow at the workshop or after the summer in our first fall events. So thank you very much, and I'm going to press the leave button at this point, and we'll see what will happen. Please show your appreciation of the panelists in whatever virtual form you can to do so. So, okay, let's see what happens. There's a red button here, and I'm going to press it.